Is this the sad end of late night American talk shows? This week's announcement by CBS that The Late Show with Stephen Colbert will come to an end next year sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. But was this really a shock to anyone who's been paying attention? Over the last decade, late night talk shows, once the reliable light entertainment behemoths of American media, have increasingly lost relevance, eyeballs, and advertising dollars alike as younger generations turn online for their carefully curated entertainment diets. A dusty old comedian, well past his prime, walks out, monologues, house bands, and bland, toothless interviews with dull celebrities trying to plug their latest dreadful ventures just seems like a relic that needs to be taken out behind the stable and put out of its limping misery. But it wasn't always like this, John. 20 years ago, you and me were raised on a televisual diet of late night talk show, which felt edgy, relevant, and spoiler alert, actually funny. So today, we want to share a little bit of a background on the history of the American late night talk show. Why were they great? And then just what happened to put the format on its last legs. Now, John, from Bertoli, Slovenia, the greatest city in the world, it's Don't Praise the Machine with Alexander Holland and John Maloney. Tonight, Pauly Shore, Madonna, with music from the Spin Doctors, plus Paul Schaefer and the CBS Orchestra. And now, the barrister with the mostest, John Maloney. That's my Alan.
Wow.
That's my Alan Coulter.
Alan Coulter could never.
I am, and we have this. We have the same coloring as well, me and Alan.
You do, yeah.
But I always found it slightly funny that he dyed his hair. Like it's one thing to dye your hair when you have dark hair, but there's something very unsettling about ginger men that reach their like 50s and 60s and just go, nah, gonna be like a 70-year-old, like really, I'm gonna look like Mick Hucknall in his 20s when I'm 80.
Yeah, it's true. It's an interesting choice. It makes me think of people on the run from the law who are trying to change their appearance to avoid being apprehended.
There's the beard line, and then you can sort of see the dye. The skin is like dyed with a little bit of ginger.
He's just got a bit of kind of bargain basement chemist warehouse men's dye, and it's seeped into his pores.
But no, so
great intro. I love that. And this is a really interesting topic. I'm looking forward to getting into it with you because, as we'll come to, and as you mentioned, you and I think both have a special place in our hearts for late night of a certain era. And it's just such an interesting phenomenon, both in terms of where it's come from and what's happened to it. And I think it's a kind of microcosm of so much in terms of, where the world is heading in terms of technology and popular culture. So we'll get into it all. But as you said, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert has been running since 2015. It's an iteration of the Late Show franchise, which was run from 1993, year zero of the DPTM universe for loyal listeners and viewers. And it's interesting that it started in that time. It's a year that, for those of you who may not be familiar with the year zero concept, has spawned a disproportionate number of things, I would say, that concern us on this show. So that's fitting. And it was started by David Letterman, who is a real giant in this world, of course, perhaps second only to Johnny Carson. Colbert himself previously hosted the Colbert Report, which was essentially a kind of satirization of conservative pundits, and he played a sort of fictionalized version of himself, and many people will be familiar with that. He got his start on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which is
That's
itself
right.
an example of this genre, and a particularly long-running one, and I'll come back to that. That's been running since 1996, and Jon Stewart has recently resumed the position at the helm of that show. So one of the things that we might talk about is that pivot that Colbert made from late night with The Daily Show in this particular character, in this particular sort of running skit, into his own show, which provided a basis for him to focus more on politics and to do so in a way which was semi-satirical, but maybe increasingly was semi-serious political comment from a kind of orthodox liberal perspective. And we might get into that as one of the burgeoning, or one of the features of the late night genre from the last 10 years, which I think has probably not been that helpful to it. But before we get into that current late night landscape and the existential moment that it finds itself in, I'd like to take you and everyone down memory lane, because once you appreciate the story of late night, you realize that its decline is really the decline of television itself, and its history is really the history of television itself. It's a really complicated history. As you mentioned, I'm in Slovenia, and trying to understand the history of late night and the different kind of strands of franchises that have come out of it. You know, the Late Show, the Late Show, the Tonight Show. It's a little bit like when I try and understand the 20th century history of the Balkans, where I currently am. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of power struggles, there's a lot of shifting periods of dominance. There's a lot of people changing sides and rivalries and hatreds and so on, loyalties divided. But it's as old as television itself. In fact, it's even older, and it was a natural development, the kind of late night format, from the golden age of radio, which itself really was influenced by kind of vaudeville, which is an even older form and used to be a kind of form of, you know, live entertainment. Got very popular. I mean, it's from Europe, I guess, but it got very popular in the US in the 19th century. And so in the golden age of radio, you had a kind of adaptation of the vaudeville format. And a famous example of that, and one that is sometimes cited as a kind of precursor to the late night format, is a show called the Pepsodent Show. Classic cliche of just a show that has a title that, yeah. And, you know, I'm sure that Pepsodent was, you know, enriched with uranium or something, and and cocaine, rubbing coke and nuclear fission, nuclear fuel on your teeth. And that show, the Pepsodent Show, ran for 10 years. So from 1938 to 1948.
Okay.
And it was hosted by the great Bob Hope. And he had a kind of, you know, fast talking, wisecracking demeanor that he obviously maintained throughout his comedy career. And you can see in the Pepsodent Show, which was, as I said, just a radio show, some familiar themes that carry through right to the present in the kind of late night format. It was a late night show. It was once a week rather than every night, but it was 10 to 10:30 at night. Hope had a sidekick named Jerry Colonna.
Okay.
And he started the show with an opening monologue, and there were skits. There were some off-the-cuff exchanges between him and Colonna. There were celebrity guests. There was some music. There were kind of running characters who were played by different people who were kind of associated with the show. And as I said, that was a continuation of this sort of vaudeville format, where it was, you know, it's kind of a variety show. You have jokes, you have music, you have guests, etc. And the Pepsodent Show ran all the way through to 1948, which, as I said, which dovetails nicely with the kind of post-war rise of television. So in the mid-40s in the United States, there were, you know, a few thousand television sets in US homes. And by 1960, there were millions of them. So that was kind of, that 10, 15-year period was really the birth of television as a popular medium. And the people who were buying these TV sets, they were people who had a kind of entertainment diet and expected it on TV. And they had it from, I guess, primarily from listening to the radio. So as soon as they started watching TV, and as soon as TV got going in the United States, this sort of format, the Pepsodent show style format, was translated into a visual medium. So, for example, that's that same year, 1948, where the Pepsodent show ended, you had the kicking off of the Ed Sullivan Show. And of course, famously, Colbert is performing to this day in the Ed Sullivan Theatre.
Right.
And, Ed Sullivan Show ran all the way to 1971. That was in the evening. It was once a week. And it became a kind of cultural lodestar for America.
I remember him introducing the Beatles. There's all this footage of him like introducing the Beatles and
Exactly.
ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome? Yeah,
that's right. It was a real it was a real center point of popular culture, and people like the Beatles and Elvis Presley, they famously kind of got their start or had their kind of flagship early performances on the Ed Sullivan Show. And you had a band, you had recurring comedic characters, you had performers and celebrity guests and skits and so on. And in fact, the first episode of the Late Show with David Letterman, which was in the Ed Sullivan Theatre in 1993, featured clips of Ed Sullivan spliced together to make it look like he was introducing David Letterman, because it was this kind of reference back to the tradition that they'd started with. You also had.
I can even bring this up, John. Look, just a little bit of that on the show. You see, is that coming up for you?
Oh yeah, there we go. Do you want to do that again, Sin? Since just brought my baby daughter.
Oh, I get. Yes, AKA she's. it's Ines Ed Sullivan Maloney.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please
I'll see you next week, Ines. I can't wait.
Yeah, that's
I can't wait to hold that baby.
Daddy's working, and and trying to put food on the table for this family. And so, yeah, you had this sense of continuity from the Ed Sullivan Show right through to Colbert, really. Then you had in 1950 a show called Broadway Open House, which is sometimes talked about as the first true late night comedy variety series, and it only aired for a short time, but it was 11 p.m. to midnight, and it was actually it was an interesting experiment because a lot of shows around that time were once a week, and this tried to be kind of, I think, 4 nights a week. And the original host only stayed on for about a year because he found the schedule really punishing, and he was also like upstaged by his female sidekick apparently, and found that kind of emasculating, so he left the show. And you had 4 years later, you had the Late Show with Steve Allen, which is a lot of people talk about as, it's the Tonight Show with Steve Allen, which is part of an ongoing franchise, and started a lot of what have become staples of late night genre television. So you have, again, an opening monologue, you've got celebrity interviews, you've got audience participation. You even had, and this is, in the 50s, comedy bits in which cameras were taken outside the studio. So it's a bit like you would see.
Like Rupert G's Deli.
Exactly. You had let's follow the camera into the kind of corridors off stage. That was this sort of slightly madcap vibe. And that was, so it's essentially what we get now. And that was the same franchise that is the first iteration of this franchise of The Tonight Show, which is, starts with Steve Allen, then you get Jack Parr, then you get Johnny Carson, who runs it for 30 years from the 60s all the way through to the 90s, which is kind of amazing. And he, I'll come back to this, but he's a kind of mentor for David Letterman. And in fact, he retired, but basically retired when, the year before Letterman starts The Late Show. Letterman loved him and idolized him. And famously, even in retirement, Johnny Carson would occasionally write jokes and send them to Letterman, who would perform them on the show.
Yeah, remember that.
And so then you get, after Carson, you get Jay Leno, then you get Conan O'Brien, then you get Jimmy Fallon. You can view that as a kind of declining graph, if you like, and and it's regarded now as the longest running scheduled entertainment program in the United States. So it's an amazing thing. I mean, it's we're talking about 70 years that it's been on the on TV. And then you have, separate to that, the late night franchise, which again was kicked off by David Letterman, who ran it for 9 years before he started the Late Show.
Mm-hmm.
That was followed by Conan O'Brien, 1993 to 2009, who I didn't really, I think I only became aware of a bit later because I didn't have kind of early cable TV in Australia, which you needed to have to watch him on TV.
I mean, it's funny. Two of the people that you've mentioned, John, and maybe even more than two. My first exposure to them was The Simpsons. So I remember that there's a Simpsons episode where Bart is the "I didn't do it" boy, and appears on the Conan O'Brien show. And to us, we were just like, is this a guy in the US? And similarly, Steve Allen, there's that
very
weird
still.
Simpsons.
Only I May Dance.
Yes, that's right. The classic line. Perfectly still. Only I May. And Steve Allen, there's a Steve Allen joke. Again, I didn't know who Steve Allen was, but he's doing a kind of, like, he's got some book called like Cooking with Steve Allen, and then
that's right.
Yeah, that was It's all my Americana references before the internet was from The Simpsons.
That's so true. Yeah, Steve Allen and even Johnny Carson is kind of
and Carson would be the same. I reckon all of these people I just would know from The Simpsons.
I remember Carson. They kind of animated his like little ticks really well, and
that's
kind of
right. He's in that classic episode.
Yeah,
with the variety show with Krusty, how it's his comeback with Bette Midler, and they make him this sort of Superman that can juggle cars and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah, which is, I guess, a kind of it's a sort of loving homage, because you had people like Conan who were involved with The Simpsons.
Yeah.
So they're all sort of from that same universe. So you've got the late night franchise kind of running alongside the Tonight Show franchise, and you've also got the Late Show, which was again partly controlled by Letterman, and it followed from his own show. And so that starts in the 90s. You famously, perhaps most well known to us, Craig Ferguson hosted that show. And he was followed by a friend of the show, the man we love to hate, James Corden, who took the reins, fucked up the show, and left in 2023. And and you also had the Daily Show, as I mentioned, running through the mid 90s, currently under Jon Stewart's stewardship. Yeah. Again, following the departure of Trevor Noah, who many people know, and he left, I think, in 2022. Okay. And you had, lots of others. I mean, I really kind of went into people have written books about this stuff, because there's so many other offshoots that were trying different things that succeeded for a time. You had, the Gary Shandling show, the Joey Bishop show, the Merv Griffin show, the Dick Cavett show, the Arsenio Hall show, and on it goes.
Yes, that's right. The Arsenio Hall show. Pure 90s.
Pure 90s. But I think, so that's just a bit of a kind of history of the genre. And you get a sense, I hope, of the kind of deep roots that it has, which, as I've said, have been around longer than television, but certainly as long as television's been a popular medium, late night variety comedy shows have been a fixture, and they haven't really changed much over that time. But I think we might sort of spend some time dwelling on a period that's meaningful for us, because I think if we kind of delve into why we liked it, we'll start to get a bit of a sense of why things have gone south for the medium. And I mean, I don't think it's, I feel as though, having reflected on it, that certainly for us, or certainly for me, I think for you, the most influential of any of these shows, past or present, is The Late Show with David Letterman. You began with Alan Coulter's spine-tingling monologue at the start. And I was kind of interested. Well, I was kind of surprised in a way to be reminded that it started in 1993. I was probably, I would have been 10 years old, and it finished a decade ago, basically carrying me and you from
Yeah.
our boyhood into our early 30s.
And
Uh,
thank God he bloody left when he did, Letterman, when you look at
mm,
how everything's gone
mm,
since then. But it was, John, I think the Late Show with David Letterman, it was the one that we got in
yeah,
Australia, I feel like. So
yeah,
it's pre-cable.
yes,
I think, and it was Channel 9, wasn't it? Channel
yep,
9 Australia had the Late Show with David Letterman, and I have
mm-hmm,
so many fond memories
mm,
of being up past my bedtime. And I think this
mm,
was also a large part of its appeal when you're a kid, is that you would, all the normal programming for the night would have been on. I think there would have even
yep,
been maybe even a late night national news program. So maybe at 9:30 or 10 there might be
yep,
the really late news.
yeah,
And then after that, it would start that classic intro with the New York skyline, and
mm,
instantly when the program started, it had that different look, because in
mm,
Australia, I think this is right. I think it was there always had to be this. This is I haven't thought about this for years. Australian television had like a certain look, which I've heard had something to do with the PAL format and the amount of scan
okay,
lines. And then whenever an
ah,
American program would come on, it had a slightly softer look to it that you could instantly
mm,
identify as, like, if you were to watch Neighbours or Home and Away, which are Australian soap operas, and
yeah,
then you would have watched like Friends or
yep,
Seinfeld, it had this
yep,
kind of hazy look to it, and you
it
instantly
did,
knew this is American, this is quality, this is
yeah.
not some bullshit Australian, like,
Thing
you
with
know.
kind of washed out. I just assumed that was because of the hole in the ozone layer in Australia. We had to watch
Sharp.
like blindingly sharp colors.
But yeah, so it would start, and you
Yeah.
would see there would be that, it would go from sharp Australian Channel 9 news, and then
Mm.
and then it would fade and it would go, have a great night, everybody. And then they
Yeah.
kind of shuffle their papers to and the camera would pan back to denote the end of the crappy Australian news.
Yeah.
And then there might be like one commercial or something, and then it would
Mm.
fade in and go, tonight it's the Late Show with, yeah. And
Yeah.
and then and you just knew, oh, because this is obviously pre-internet, so you're up
Mm.
late,
Mm.
and you just are going to get, like, maybe they mention an actor that you love or a comedian who's going to be, and you'd sit there and wait, and you'd go like, oh, who's going to
Yeah.
be on, and then Alan
Yeah.
Coulter would announce, and
Yeah.
it might be like a comedian that you really wanted to see, or
Yeah.
if you were really lucky, they would mention a band or a musician that was
Mm.
going to be at the end of the show.
Smashing pumpkins, they say.
And you'd be like, man, I was going to go to bed. My parents
Mm.
really want me in bed, but I'm going to sneakily stay up late because I want to. And you felt like you were getting this edgy little nugget
Yeah.
into popular culture, which was from the
Yeah.
United States. And you're going, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not watching Hey Hey It's Saturday. I'm watching The Late Show with David Letterman.
Exactly.
I'm really tuned in. I'm up late and I'm tuned
Yeah.
in.
I'm in the greatest city in the world.
It's
And
just for a minute. I'm in the
yeah,
greatest city in the world.
it's true. It's really funny when you talk about it, because in preparing, I was kind of trying to remember that feeling. And it's quite unique in my experience of watching TV, that sense that you kind of get this little tickle of excitement that you're sort of in on something. It's late at night.
Mm.
You're in this community of people who are up late.
Late night people,
late night
the
people.
countercultural people,
Exactly.
the
They're a bit
artists,
devil
the
may care.
wackos, the
Exactly.
stoners,
The slackers and
slackers,
the 90s slacker community.
the junkies, the whores.
and you're up, you're a bit devil may care. You want to
Yeah.
have a laugh. You want to have some absurdity. And there was this sense that because it was late at night, which again, you don't really get on the internet because you're just watching something that could be happening at any time. But because it's late at night, sort of a bit like, well, anything could happen now. Like, Drew
Yeah.
Barrymore could get her tits out famously.
Yes.
And it's a bit like, and David kind of carries you through, he's very relaxed. He's got this kind of lovely sort of slightly aloof, slightly cantankerous, but sort of endearing demeanor. And it was a bit like being at a party with a really good host or something, you're kind of getting taken through. And I've read this really good description, which is a bit sort of sentimental, but I think does capture something. It's Seth Stevenson, who was writing for Slate in 2015 when Letterman ended, and days before Letterman retired, he described what it was like to attend a taping of the Late Show. And it's a bit kind of mawkish, but I think it does capture something. He says, "It felt almost regal to enter the Ed Sullivan Theatre beneath a lit marquee on 53rd and Broadway, instead of through some unmarked dented metal door under an industrial block of Hell's Kitchen. The theatre for the Late Show with David Letterman seats 450 people instead of 100, and its rococo balcony offers a glorious view over the sprawling stage where the Beatles first performed in America. Instead of bathing us in washed-out, piped-in music or a half-hearted pop quintet, Paul Schaefer and the CBS Orchestra rocked us with a wall of sound, including a horn section that blasted riffs clear to the theatre rafters. It was hard not to sit in that Late Show audience and feel, for the first time, indispensable. Letterman puts on a show. He presents fully rounded entertainment, and he feeds off the energy in the room. This is a big, brassy venue with a live orchestra instead of a cramped black box studio with somebody's iPod plugged into ceiling speakers. And Letterman needed us there. And so that's a kind of nice, I think is a nice demonstration of kind of the best of live television as distinct from, recording something in a sort of makeshift home studio the way that we are now. I mean, I'd love to have Paul Schaefer's orchestra just
and a rococo
yeah, exactly.
balcony.
And I mean, yeah, so I remember seeing, as I said, Drew Barrymore flashing her breasts, or I certainly remember hearing about that.
Yeah.
I remember the top 10 list that you'd get at the start of the show.
Of course.
Where he'd say top 10, and sometimes it was a bit obscure. And I kind of would get some of it, but not all of it, which reminded me of when Bart and Milhouse get the Mad magazine and they're like sort of understanding some of the jokes, but then they're like, who is this Spiro Agnew guy? I felt a bit like that watching the top 10 list sometimes, but I laughed along. Got Alan Coulter's, as we've said, lilting intro voice. You had Rupert G from the Hello Deli.
Rupert G and the Hello Deli. It just so made me. It's not there anymore, but I was desperate. Or he sold it maybe to somebody else. But to explain to people, essentially near the Ed Sullivan Theatre was this New York sandwich shop. And I guess somebody from the show, maybe David Letterman, I guess used to go in there and I guess struck up a bit of a friendship with the owner, who was this Asian American guy called Rupert G. And it's kind of almost like a precursor to what's popular on the internet, because he was this very unremarkable man, which is what made, and he always seemed so they would do these bits with him where David Letterman would go, I wonder what's happening with Rupert G at the Hello Deli. Rupert, what you doing over there? And then it would just cross the camera and it would cut to a live broadcast of Rupert G literally in his little Manhattan deli. Be like, hey, David, how you going? And David would be like, I'm great, Rupert. What are you doing? He'd go, oh, nothing. Just it's been a busy morning. And then
he just got on that sandwich there.
What you got on that sandwich there? Oh, yeah, we got you know, it was Parmesan or something. And he always just seemed like he was not particularly put upon, but also didn't really seem to care that much if David Letterman wanted to talk to him or not.
It didn't feel like he was kind of rising to the occasion at all. He was just like, he was not, made to be a celebrity. He was just like, here, I'll tell you about my deli if you want. And then
and he never had particularly interesting stories or anything. Right. And that was kind of why it was funny, because Letterman was in this huge theater with hundreds of people watching him, and on the screen was just this little deli man going, oh yeah, everything's pretty good here, I guess.
Exactly. Which is such a kind of, I mean, that had a brand of absurdity, which that skit sort of typifies, which is, I think it's kind of influenced what we find funny and in some ways kind of maybe even how we do this very show.
And before we move on, John, another person that I just thought of that we'd forgotten about, I think he had did he have the cue cards or was he doing some sort of production? Biff Henderson.
Biff Henderson. Yeah, that's right.
Who was the sort of short in stature, bald African-American fellow who had some sort of role on the floor on the Dave Letterman show. And Dave would throw to him quite a lot as well. I think I'm even forgetting there was a cue cards guy whose name I forget, who Dave would also address quite a lot.
Exactly.
And then famously, James Corden didn't know any of the names of his crew.
Exactly. Yeah, you can imagine them all kind of getting along with Letterman. But
Letterman made them characters on his show, whereas Corden couldn't remember their fucking names.
Yeah, Corden was like, "Stay the fuck out of my way. Don't look me in the face." You had Will it float. You had, of course, great moments in presidential speeches when George W. Bush's speeches were lampooned in contrast to, JFK and FDR.
Yeah. And maybe that leads us on, John, as to just touching on politics.
Yeah.
What went so wrong with the late night format?
Yeah. So the thing that I was thinking about in terms of exploring the contrast is when you watched The Late Show with David Letterman, he had this kind of cantankerous, aloof sort of demeanor sometimes. And you could tell when he really liked a guest as opposed to when he was just going through the motions. Or sometimes he would actively dislike someone and would sort of get into this slightly adversarial back and forth with them.
He was never starstruck.
No.
He never came across as a sycophant with anyone. He'd have literally the biggest star on earth in front of him at that stage. So it would be somebody like Madonna, and he would have a kind of push-pull like relationship with them as they sat across from him at the desk.
Yeah, he'd be sort of sitting back in his chair going, And people who took themselves too seriously or were sanctimonious or were kind of oversensitive, they were basically taken down a few pegs. And that was what was so enjoyable about it. And that is,
and it's what we also, just to interrupt, John, we also used to contrast him a lot with Rove McManus, who was trying to do something similar in Australia. It was meant to be it was very much like the Australian David Letterman show, but it was so lame because Rove had that it's kind of understandable because this is this kind of Australian thing where we're so excited if anybody from like America or the UK gives us any attention. So we'd get these celebrities coming down to plug their movies.
Yeah.
And Rove would just be like, "Oh, I can't believe you came to me show." And it was just fucking lame.
It's true.
And me and you just used to go, "This is so lame. Like, you should push back. You should just be like, fuck you. I don't care that you're, that it's Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
Like, you're
on my show." Exactly. And that was the sort of power dynamic that made it enjoyable to watch. And that is something that, the idea in the current landscape that you would get someone like Jimmy Fallon sort of sassing a celebrity on his show, maybe kind of calling out their bullshit. It's just unthinkable. And that really, to me, that really typifies or exemplifies what's changed. You've obviously got a kind of, in some ways, a more crowded talk show landscape, at least until the last couple of years. You had, Corden, Fallon, Kimmel, Noah, etc. And in the lead up to Colbert's show ending, which it will next year, you've had a couple of other closures. You've had James Corden's tenure ending, and I don't think they sort of fumbled the succession plan, and it seems like they've just decided to let it go now. So that's the end of that. You've got Trevor Noah leaving The Daily Show, and
that was also so lame.
Yeah, it was.
Like, I would watch clips of Trevor Noah and just be like, "Oh,
this
is the lamest shit."
And the thing that united them was, well, there were a couple of things, but one of them I think was, they tried to present themselves, unlike, say, Letterman or even Conan, they tried to present themselves as kind of nice, everyman. I'm a bit of something for everyone. And I've also got a kind of, mushy liberal perspective that you can enjoy, that we can all revel in and whatever. But then there were these kind of series of revelations that were pretty consistent when you look back on it, in terms of basically puncturing their sort of nice guy image. So you had, these stuff about Jimmy Fallon actually being a sort of moody prick on his show and sort of terrorizing the cast. Sometimes they'd say he'd come in and be pain in the ass and whatever, and be really angry that their jokes weren't funny. You had James Corden, as we previously talked about on this show, screaming at waiters at Balthazar and then stealing jokes from other people and not knowing any of his crew's names. And you had this kind of people dredging up jokes that Trevor Noah told about Aboriginal people in Australia, basically racist jokes. And all of that was so much more damaging because
or Kimmel in blackface.
Exactly.
But then of course coming out and sort of cancelling anybody who'd made the slightest indiscretion.
Yeah, that's right. And it was
in their past.
It was so much more damaging because they were trying to keep this really squeaky clean image. And I don't know whether that was because the genre and really television itself was sort of under threat as a medium, and that made them firstly, it made them more cautious. It made the show more cautious, probably the networks. It also meant that they needed guests more than the guests needed them to an extent. And so they had to kind of suck up people's bullshit. And whereas like Letterman would be like, well, you want to be on the show, that's really up to me. And if you come here, you're getting incredible exposure and I'll sort of treat you how I want. Whereas you never get that sense from Jimmy Fallon's guests. He's kind of laughs just as fakely at all of them, no matter how kind of bland they are. And the whole thing just feels very safe. It doesn't feel like anyone's going to say something terrible or like get their breasts out.
Everybody's fake laughing. Like everybody on the show is fake laughing. I think there's if you were to ask me, I'd say there's two things that have killed late night. And the first one, as we always say, in the words of the great Canadian electronic musician Tiga, it's the P of the I am. It's the power of the internet, mister, which is
such a beautiful quote. Yeah.
It's such a great quote. Which is
solid quest.
Solid quest.
Sorry.
Which is that now everybody can get edgy, real commentary on and entertainment from the internet. So take me for example, my kind of like the people who I would go to now for like comedy and a bit of politics would be people like Tim Dillon. And then I'm like a lot of people, I'm spending fucking 10 hours a week listening to podcasts. So that's where I'm getting all my information. And this is one of the reasons that they say that, this is, I think, one of the reasons that they gave for cancelling Colbert is Colbert has like a staff of, I think, hundreds of people.
Right.
And he makes this little show which gets way less viewership and listenership than the Joe Rogan podcast, which is like Rogan, his producer Jamie, and a small team of bookers and other people. Probably he's got like probably a lawyer and a manager. Yeah, it's like a 4-person team. Yeah, and then he's like selling MeUndies ad slots for like $1 million. Yeah, just the costs have got to be fucking so
profit
low.
Margins would be enormous,
and the profit margins are just eye-watering. And then you've got like Colbert doing this thing. I think so there's that. It's just kind of lost its relevance, its tooth. It's. I think the other thing in their defense, what I would say is that after Trump got elected, the culture shifted. So the vibe shifted in such a way that everything had to become political. Like I guess it's funny. Letterman wind up in 2015?
Yeah.
So it's perfect timing.
Exactly.
Because he literally leaves just before Trump comes in.
Yeah, that's right.
And I wonder how he would have handled the Trump presidency, because basically once Trump came in, everybody was basically saying I mean, myself included back then, everybody expected everybody in entertainment to go, well, Trump's the worst thing ever in the world, so now that needs to be the focus of everything. You couldn't come out in 2016 and just be like, hey, look, I know that everybody is just picking sides right now, and it's hyper. Every time I open the news, it's politics. But guess what? We're not really going to pick sides here.
We're just going to do another Will It Float segment.
Exactly. you would have to do like, and so everybody just, I mean, and this is kind of entertainment more generally, is that it
Totally.
leans more liberal. And so, of course, then you just get these echo chambers where the writers' rooms go, okay, now we're going to be like
Yeah.
anti-Trump and we're going to be really pro sort of more left-wing issues.
Yeah.
And so then every time you turned on, and I think also in a sense the ground had kind of been laid for that by Colbert in the
Yeah.
Bush era, where he had sort of set this kind of foundation and this blueprint of, hey, you know what, you can do funny comedy shows where you lambast the conservatives in the US. And I think a lot of people just went, yeah, okay, well, I guess in this Trump era, that'll be fine.
what we
Because
do.
remember, Colbert did it and everybody what was critically acclaimed.
Yeah.
And then I remember watching like the first year or two of Colbert.
Yeah.
I was thinking, man, the Colbert Report was the best thing I'd ever seen. And then I remember just
so good.
tuning in and going, this is like, who is this man?
Yeah.
Like, this is the lamest shit.
Yeah. He was really kind of, it's a terrible word to use, but he was sort of like a neutered version of himself as opposed to like an edgy, quite experimental, quite novel comedian on The Daily Show. And even The Daily Show, I mean, Jon Stewart was obviously very political, but he did it in this kind of wry, genuinely funny and sort of more inclusive way. And I think the other thing that shifted, and I mean, obviously on Letterman, it wasn't entirely apolitical. Like you had those great moments in presidential speeches where he was mocking how inarticulate George W. Bush was. You had a sort of special after 9/11 and whatever, but it was this kind of escape from politics. But I think the other thing that shifted is the location or the place of news media as distinct from late night comedy shows. You obviously had a kind of decline in establishment, sort of tentpole news media. And I think that meant that to an extent, late night was kind of in this weird position, or has been in this weird position for the last 5 or 10 years, particularly, as you say, in the kind of Trump era, where it is partly performing the role of informing people about what's going on in the country from a news perspective and providing a kind of think piecey, laced with comedy, but also sort of genuinely meant to provide some direction or insight into how people, particularly on the left, should respond to what's going on in the country, which is very weird. It's kind of a weird development. I mean, as I remember Norm Macdonald, when he was still around, lamenting or just talking about how strange that was, and using the example of this kind of guy, again, from that sort of golden age of radio, early era of TV, this sort of madcap idiot comedian called Red Skelton, and saying like nobody gave a shit what like Red Skelton thought of the Vietnam War, because it was just like he was just kind of a goofball, and you wouldn't necessarily care about what any of those early, you might care about what Letterman had to say about politics, but he wasn't really that forthcoming about it. And then suddenly you're in this era where like the New York Times is saying, oh, this thing's happened, Trump's done this, and let's do a rundown of what, the late night hosts have said about it. And it's like, what? Who cares? Like, it's weird kind of, they've become basically part of the liberal media rather than being a distinct comedy subgenre.
They became like just sort of quite a clear arm of the kind of Democrat Party. And so you just, whether or not you're pro or anti that side of politics, it just became so predictable and lame, because you're just like, okay, great. It's just going to be a full hour of Trump jokes, and then all the guests are also from Hollywood, so they're going to make Trump jokes. There's a famous clip, actually, if you've not seen it, John, when Colbert got cancelled this week. There were people on, of course, Twitter's pretty anti-Colbert, and there were people sharing some clips of him, and one of the quite striking ones, which points to this thing that we're talking about, is Colbert has Claire Danes on a couple of years ago, and Claire Danes was in that show that was about spies something.
Yep.
Do you remember that?
I think it was called something like that.
I forget what it was called, but it was Claire Danes spy show, Homeland, it was called.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So Claire Danes was in Homeland. She goes on Colbert and Colbert's doing the Colbert thing where he's like, it's amazing. Like, how did you know how to be spies? And she's like, well, actually, and this is, I think, just after Trump. It was during the first Trump administration. And she starts saying, she goes, actually, you know, in order for us to really get this correct, we actually had actual spooks from the CIA, ex-spooks or current spooks from the CIA who came in and advised us. And Colbert's like, wow, so are they teaching you all like crazy spy tricks with like a laser in your watch or something, MacGyver? And she says, you know, actually, like, it's crazy because, you know, we were having really interesting discussions because, you know, this current administration is very sort of anti the CIA. And so we were discussing, you know, the spooks were kind of telling me the various ways. And she basically says that they had current like CIA people come and advise them. And then in just general conversation, they essentially told Claire Danes how they were undermining the Trump administration.
Wow.
And then Colbert leaps in and changes the subject.
Wow.
It's like he clearly just goes, that's not the message, and he leaps in, and it's a 180, and then he just switches it because he goes, "You're not supposed to say that," and it just points to this thing of how politicized. Because she obviously comes on and it was this weird thing, like everybody's okay. All the guests hate Trump, the hosts hate Trump, and then again, whether you hate Trump or not, it's just like I get that, like
it's not,
you know, at least fucking Letterman would do Clinton. How many times did they lambast Clinton?
Yeah, exactly.
And then once Trump came in, it was this thing of, well, Trump's so terrible that we can't do anything that's going to help
anyone
him.
Who mocks the left is kind of is basically going to lose the war for us, and if we can't afford that. Which I guess, I mean, this is why Jon Stewart is a shade better in my view, because he's somebody who's able to say, like, these people on the left are kind of dumbos and funny, as well as, you know, having a kind of position that's maybe he's kind of left leaning, but at least in a kind of self-deprecating and sort of somewhat more authentic way. But it was also this kind of, I remember him actually being on the Colbert show and talking about, like, kind of jokingly, but talking about the sort of Wuhan lab leak theory at a time when that was also not kind of something that people on the left allowed themselves to entertain. And it was the same thing where he starts saying, well, I don't know, what do you think, Stephen? Like, they've got a Wuhan coronavirus laboratory. And that's where the virus started. And Colbert just looks so uncomfortable and just kind of quickly changes the topic. And I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm not expressing a view on that. What I'm saying, I guess, is like, that's not like having that kind of political, you know, having that kind of political undercurrent or subtext. It's just antithetical to the sort of freewheeling, funny vibe that kind of allowed late night to flourish in the era that we talked about.
And it also just clearly ostracizes anybody who's not a dyed in the wool Democrat.
Totally.
So obviously somebody like Letterman would have had, and again, it was a different political landscape at the time, but you would have had people from both sides of the aisle
totally
tuning in and enjoying that. Whereas if you if you voted Republican and you watch fucking Colbert, it's just like, you're a terrible person every second.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So I do wonder what Letterman would have made of that. And I guess you're right. It's a combination of the P of the I, and then this effect of, you know, that having an effect on kind of news media and the role of news media, that putting a squeeze on TV, which meant they're like just going to play it safe because they're more desperate for kind of ad revenue, and they're more they're more desperate to maintain their ratings, and it's not a given as it was with the Late Show that people will tune in, etc. So it's this sort of death spiral, and you know, people are talking about the cancellation of Colbert's show as possibly arising from his criticism of Trump, because CBS or its parent company Paramount is doing this big merger with Skydance, which required presidential approval, and I think they gave a donation, or sorry, they gave a kind of settlement fee to Trump or something to kind of try and put this to bed, and then suddenly they're canceling Colbert. Now, maybe that's part of the calculation, or maybe it's not, but either way, he was kind of, it wasn't going to go on forever, and it's hard to know, like, Colbert's not a spring chicken, and it's hard to know what would happen to that show when he leaves, just as it's hard to know what's going to happen when Jon Stewart, who's kind of been pulled out of retirement to replace Trevor Noah, what happens when he leaves The Daily Show? Like, who's going to fill those shoes, or even want to fill those shoes, as opposed to, as you say, doing their own thing, on YouTube. And yet, I do feel sad because, I mean, think about that long history that we talked about, and the fact that nothing has really replaced, at least for me, there's nothing that I watch that kind of I can tune into regularly that sort of sets the tone culturally, that summarizes the week's events, that shows me, like, here's some bands that you might like, here's some comedians you might like. I guess there's those sorts of things around, but they're much more fragmented and niche. And I think for a lot of people, that's us, that's this show. And so
I think so too.
Being on this show, it's hard for me because I can't tune into myself for inspiration.
If I could tune into myself, I would.
Exactly. But it's an interesting tale.
Everybody who was watching, I know there's some Don't Praise the Machine listeners out there who occasionally you'd listen to Don't Praise the Machine, but most of the time you would watch The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And I'm saying, guys, don't worry. You can just come over here every week and just watch us, because this is what our show's about. It's about the death of culture.
Yeah.
It's about the death of traditional media. It's about more power being given to true comedians and true mavericks,
exactly,
like me and John. And we will, we don't like James Corden, we don't like Jimmy Fallon, we don't like Trevor Noah. If you don't like Jimmy Fallon and Colbert and Trevor Noah,
come to
and
us.
Samantha Bee, and who have I missed here?
Jimmy Kimmel.
Actually, I used to like Seth Meyers, and I still occasionally tune into that, but even that seems uncomfortable and a bit wooden now. That
it is a bit wooden
show. We're much more we're your Letterman, Conan O'Brien, even Jay Leno, and particularly I loved the flirtatious devil may care energy of Craig Ferguson when he used to be on the show. He's
the kind of guy that network executives now would just be waking up at 3 a.m. worrying about.
Sweating. I remember the first time I ever saw him, he was like Drew Carey's boss in the Drew Carey show,
right.
I think that's right. And that was the first time I ever saw him. And then suddenly he was, and I must look up Craig Ferguson's career, because I think he's Scottish. And I just remember being like, how is a Scottish guy on the Drew Carey show? And then why is he suddenly a late night host?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
It's quite a trajectory. And he always had this vibe of like, he was the kind of village funny guy who'd shot to the heights, because he was a real good wisecracker. He was kind of charming. He's very sort of flirtatious in a way which would be borderline unpalatable now, but
totally.
But managed to kind of keep it light enough and be and sort of make it obvious that he was just sort of being funny in a way that sort of stopped it from being creepy. I mean, there might be people who would listen to that and say, no, you're wrong, it was creepy. But that's my impression. And then you have bloody, another man who's come across the Atlantic and tried to make his home in the United States, James Corden, who's got none of those qualities, who just yells at waiters and steals jokes.
Literally like the world's worst man. Exactly. I think he's got to be. He's in the Don't Praise the Machine. He's probably number one in the Don't Praise the Machine Hall of Shame.
Exactly.
It's got to be. Like everything about him is just like, fuck this guy.
Yeah, that's right. And he's gone, and as I say, he's kind of tanked the franchise. He's tanked the franchise, but he was somebody who just he always kind of had this sense, which I guess is, a bit indicative of the lot of them, where yeah, you never felt like you were getting the real him. And he was always sort of playing a character and, sucking up to people in this really sort of skin crawly way. And it's just not how you have a good time. So,
and the other thing I think we should end on, John, as well, is that he complained about the service at Balthazar. And I want to say that the service at Balthazar was impeccable. I had never been served. So they had two types of waiters, which I didn't even, they had two like tiers of waiters that I'd never even seen before, which is that we had a waiter that like took our order.
Yeah.
And then we had like other waiters that brought the food.
Yeah.
It was like a hierarchy that I'd never even seen in service before. The waiter came over and was like, "What do you want?" And we were like, this, and this. And then they disappeared and the food turned up straight away and it was delicious. And then as soon as my coffee cup was empty, the waiter was there again and said, "Do you want another one?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then another different person appeared from another door.
Yeah.
And served it to me.
It was next level.
And I paid a lot of money for that.
Yeah.
A lot of money, but I loved it.
Yeah. No, it's not cheap, but it's very good. And I would have thought somebody from the UK would be bowled over by that kind of friendly service. I mean, you and I used to make jokes about people in venues that we'd go into in London being part of some scheme because they appeared not to be able to hear or see us the whole time. They'd serve you without making any eye contact or saying anything to you or acknowledging the pleasantness of your presence in any way. So, but
maybe you should give a shout out to M, because she's the one who took us to Balthazar.
Yeah, shout out to M. She's I'm sure she's a aficionado of the 90s late night era. And she took us to Balthazar. I've recently seen her in Europe and she's a great DPTMer. So thanks very much, M, for your continued inspiration and support. But I digress. We've done a deep dive into the history of the late night genre, into what for us were its glory days, and into what happened to it and what happens now. And the answer to what happens now is us. It's fallen to us.
The baton is passed.
Exactly.
The baton has been passed. And as we say goodbye to everybody on this week's episode of Don't Press the Machine, I can make a late night television moment music recommendation, which I only watched last week. And I watched it because I saw one of our favorite comedians, Brian Limond, aka Limmy from Scotland. And he was commenting. It was a video of him reacting to the band Future Islands playing on David Letterman.
Yep.
And I didn't realize that this is held up as this particularly incredible and surprising music performance, which I guess must have been in either Letterman ends in 2015 and Future Islands haven't been around that long. So it must have been like 13, 14, maybe 15 that they appeared.
Right.
And Letterman obviously doesn't have any idea who they are. I don't think a lot of people did at the time. I think the story goes that they like drove in a van like a long way to get to the gig and then they kind of jumped on stage.
Wow.
And anybody who knows Future Islands knows that the lead singer has a very particular style of singing, but it's his dancing which is so unique. And he's just being himself. They seem totally comfortable on stage. They do their performance. Letterman introduces them at the end of the show, as he always would. The musical guest comes on at the end of the show. "Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Future Islands?" Everybody applauds. Then they perform, and they're just doing what they know to do.
Yeah.
They're just performing at Future Islands, and he's doing his funky dance and his incredibly weird vocal gymnastics.
Yeah.
And you can just, when it ends,
he's a bit
the crowd
kind of
goes
Morrissey-esque, isn't he?
Even he's sort of Morrissey-esque, but he's really like dipping down, doing his dancing, and he even sort of goes into, he's doing this kind of Future Islands voice, and then he sort of does a tiny bit of like death metal at one bit at the end, and you're just going, what is this?
Yeah. And
Letterman is just blown away. You can just tell that Letterman has watched musical guest after musical guest, which is fine. He's like, great, you did a little song, it's Hootie and the Blowfish. Great, I know what to expect. And Letterman just goes, "How about that? Tremendous.
Wow.
How about that? Good to meet you."
Yeah, right.
"Man, ladies and gentlemen, what about Future Islands?" And everybody is just going mad. And then Limmy, if you watch it, also then watch you can find the Limmy reacting to it. And he talks about the first time that he ever saw that clip and how he didn't know if the guy was like, if it was serious or if it was a joke. Right. And he said it was kind of bending his brain. Everybody, late night television musical moment, Future Islands.
Yeah, and of course, the other thing to watch is the finale of the Letterman show, bittersweet as that is, and Norm Macdonald's heartfelt monologue, which ends with him kind of getting a bit emotional about Dave's inspiration to him and them embracing, which is very sweet, particularly from Dave, who's not a man given to kind of sincere emotions. But it's all gone now. All we've got is plastered on smiles and people sweating over rating spreadsheets. And that's
Jimmy Kimmel. I tell you what, Jimmy Kimmel could use a little bit of David Letterman's stoicism instead of fucking bawling his eyes out whenever like Trump gets reelected.
Exactly.
Jesus Christ.
Come on, Jimmy. You used to be on the Man Show.
Yeah, exactly. What happened to the Man Show? Put on the Karl Malone blackface again, Jimmy. We loved it. Do the mailman again.
Exactly. The mailman.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's been Don't Praise the Machine, and we can't wait to see you next week.
Podcast.